so you really couldn't figure out who created it or what it was about. So did one of the other managers that was competing to move up the chain. So I'm sitting in an office, and George, the head of sales, says to me, you know what, Harvey's walking up the stairs right now, and he's going to go into Lloyd's office. Lloyd is now the CEO of Goldman Sachs. At the time, he was running FIC, which was the Fixed Income Currency and Commodities Division. And what you need to do is you need to take the other route around the trading floor. You need to get into Lloyd's office before Harvey goes up the stairs into Lloyd's office and takes credit for the trade that your group is working on. And I'm like, I'm hesitating. He's like, go. Go. Needless to say, I actually didn't make it in time. It turned out I wasn't as good. Harvey was also very big, and he was motivated. He ultimately rose up the chain, as did Lloyd, and everybody became happy. But the point is, there's an actual strategy on a regular basis, not just to take credit for a trade, but to actually maneuver to do it and have the conversation, get in front. And that manifests itself throughout entire groups and entire companies on Wall Street. And ultimately, it pervades Wall Street and goes into Washington. When people go from Wall Street to Washington, such as the Treasury Secretary last year when TARP was created, Henry Paulson, when he becomes basically CEO of the Treasury from CEO of Goldman Sachs, that mentality continues. How much can I commandeer whatever money is on the table in order to do what it is I want to do and then take credit for it? And that's kind of a lot of the philosophy that goes from Wall Street to Washington and has really been a part of why, ultimately, Wall Street got so much from Washington in this bailout. We'll talk about the numbers, I guess, in a little bit, because that's the game. The same game that's running to an office to get money in that particular moment and credit for a trade is the same game that's trying to get that money into your company for your merger from the Treasury and from the American public. It's really the same mentality, and here we are.
In Matt's speech from the summer, he talks about the old Goldman Sachs, certainly way before you got there, Nomi, and the operating philosophy in the great old days was something like greed, but long term. The idea was, we're not going to do anything that's disruptive to the wider system. We're going to do stuff that is in the longer-term interests of the company and presumably longer-term interests of everybody else. It doesn't sound like the philosophy that you were indoctrinated into when you got there.
No, there's instant gratification is like huge on Wall Street. It's as instant as that moment in that trade or that quarter's result or that bonus that year. It's very much about right now. And it has become about right now every single day. It's more about right now. So you can imagine sort of the acceleration of this idea. And old school, there was some idea of we'll build something, we'll take profit from it, we'll make money in the long haul, we're a part of this thing forever, or something, some sense of forever. And now it's very much like this bonus, this year, this trade, right now.
Nomi, as you hear, focuses her firepower on the big finance, big B, big F. But Dan, I want to ask you about this. The president was down on Wall Street just a couple of weeks ago, briefly made that speech at Federal Hall. And the President of the United States described this thing that we've been living through as, quote, a collective failure of responsibility across America. As a matter of culpability and consequences, the term collective responsibility, in a way, has been read by, that's what I heard, gee, we're all, the fault, dear Brutus, lies within ourselves. Maybe I wanted to buy a house, and maybe I got a mortgage that was a little too cheap, maybe riskier than one should have. Do you think that's fair? That in fact, kind of all complicit in this, and we shouldn't point such powerful rhetoric at the big guys?
Well, I think it's 80% right and 100% wrong. Which is to say that, there are two sides to every trade. Every loan, there was a borrower. There were a fair number of borrowers who maybe should have known better or didn't take the time to do what Susie Orman tells them to do and read the fine print. There were speculators who were buying their 8th and 9th and 10th condo with no money down. But my wife often says, uses the example of, say we're in a house and everybody starts yelling. Me and my 2 children. Me being the adult should know better and should control my temper, whereas they are children who don't have the experience of life to control themselves. This is not to say that Americans are children, but when you look at the hierarchy and the mistakes that were made, and I tried to lay out in my book that it wasn't done by the least of us. This was done by the most of us. It was the most well-respected economist in the world, the Greenspan, who got so much of this wrong and laid the foundation for this. It was the top firms, it wasn't the bad firms on Wall Street, it was the ones with the highest reputation where everybody wanted to work that got it wrong. And you can go on down the road. So this was, was there a culpability by people who borrowed money they shouldn't have? Yes, it's not smart to borrow money you can't pay back. But, we had a decade where there was no growth in income. The median income did not rise between 1999 and 2008, and the cost of other things like housing and education and healthcare, gas, food, was rising quite rapidly. So a lot of people were forced into debt by necessity, or what they felt was necessity, and they would not have been able to go into debt had not Wall Street been standing there telling them that they had gold in their backyard. I use the example that it's like the Beverly Hillbillies, where they found black gold in their backyard. We were told that we have these reservoirs of capital, namely home equity, in your backyard, in your house, and Wall Street was standing there ready to help us with the equipment to tap it. Give us a home equity line of credit, or a second mortgage, or a refinancing. And the greatest economic minds of our day were telling us that this all made perfect sense.
Matt, when you hear this idea of collective responsibility, what are your thoughts?
I agree with Dan 100% on this. I think, since I started doing this kind of reporting, I've really seen three different ways to look at this whole issue. The first is the complete lunatic version of what happened, which is that the banks were somehow pressured into lending to unworthy borrowers because of the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977. Somehow that problem magically didn't manifest itself until 2008. It didn't matter. There were no credit derivatives throughout that entire time period during the early 80s. But that's the crazy version. The part that people get tripped up on is the sort of medium version, because if you look at it from an objective point of view, if you're some unemployed meth addict, living in suburban Phoenix, you probably shouldn't be taking out $1 million mortgage. If you don't have any money and you're just sitting getting high in your house all day long, that's not responsible and probably ultimately not good for society if there were lots and lots of people who were doing
Taking
that.
the mortgages are responsible? Or
Probably both. On the other hand, though, they made all that credit available to people, and they did it with their eyes wide open. And this was sort of a conscious policy that Wall Street had for years and years and years. They sort of borrowed into existence this gigantic mountain of money, and they were just going to try to roll it forward for a little while and shave little bits of it off, step by step. And in the end, it turns out that they asked us to buy it through the bailouts, when it all blew up in their faces. So this was really something that was, sort of a massive corruption at the very highest levels. And at the individual level, sure, a lot of the things that people did were not smart. But it's, if somebody's offering you $1 million house for nothing, how many people are not going to take that offer? I think people would have always behaved that way had that been available in the 40s or 50s or 60s. What changed in the early part of this decade is that suddenly all this new credit was available and there were these new innovations that made this possible. And that was solely Wall Street's responsibility, and that had nothing to do